My name is Matt-Zarb cousin. I'm from Clean Up Gambling. We're a pressure group based in Britain, and we are calling for a series of reforms to the Gambling Act, the 2005 Gambling Act, which was obviously written in an era before smartphones. And obviously now online is predominantly done on a smartphone. The context has shifted significantly in the last 10 years, and public attitudes have changed, and the political context has definitely moved towards more restrictive, in being in favour of more restrictive legislation on gambling. And this is a phenomenon that's really, I think, been replicated across Europe. And I think it's a sign of a jurisdiction that's becoming more acclimatized to gambling liberalisation. So my presentation today is really about how the remote gambling sector can reform itself so that it can future-proof, so that it can survive the next decade. So a bit about the context. So the liberalisation of gambling in the UK obviously followed the 2005 Gambling Act, and this was seen as a liberalising piece of legislation. Online gambling really wasn't regulated and properly under the 2005 Gambling Act until the legislation was updated again in 2014. So in Britain, online gambling has only really formally been regulated for about 6 years. In 2005, it saw which was enacted, this legislation in 2007, it saw the legalisation of advertising. And what that's led to is a huge influx of advertising during live sporting events. And really, I think it's created a lot of opposition to the liberalisation of gambling among people that don't gamble, people that just see the advertising and feel that it's gone too far. As I said, the regulation of online gambling has only been in place since 2014. And in that time, when the legislation was passed, there was a mass approval of remote gambling licenses. Lots of operators were licensed, smaller operators were licensed by the Gambling Commission due to a huge influx of license applications. A lot of these operators really, looking back, should never have been licensed in the first place. And obviously this has had a really negative impact on the industry as a whole, and the reputation of the industry as a whole, because what it's meant is there's lots of smaller operators that are pretty unscrupulous, here today, gone tomorrow. And there's not adequate oversight from the Gambling Commission. It can't possibly keep tabs on what has essentially become thousands of licensees. In that time, and since 2014, gross gambling yield has obviously increased year on year, and now we're in a situation where online gambling generates just under £5 billion gross gambling yield as of last year. And this is the important point: 60% of the profits are coming from 5% of the customers who are likely to be experiencing gambling problems, and that's from the House of Lords Gambling Industry Select Committee report. And this is important context because I think it's an indication as to why public attitudes have shifted. So in the UK, fixed odds betting terminals, which were machines in betting shops that permitted bets of up to £100 every 20 seconds, were restricted last year to £2 a spin, and that legislation was enacted in April 2019. And this followed really quite adversarial campaign between myself, gambling reformers, and the Association of British Bookmakers, who were recalcitrant, very opposed to any kind of reforms at all. And leading on from that, obviously the government has the Conservative Party were responsible for the reforms to fixed odds betting terminals, proved very popular, and in their manifesto going into the 2019 general election, they committed to a gambling review. That commitment was restated at the start of the year in the Queen's Speech, which is the legislative programme, and it's set to commence that gambling review in due course, probably within the next 3 weeks. We're expecting the terms of reference early next month. In that time, in the last couple of years, particularly when the government's moved towards more restrictive gambling legislation, there's been a shift away from a player-centric understanding of gambling harm. Now, in the past, gambling harm was seen as a matter of individual responsibility, individual predisposition, and if someone was experiencing gambling-related harm, they were considered a problem gambler, and there was something wrong with them. There was some kind of faulty individual that couldn't stay in control. And I think government policies definitely, and government understanding definitely widened now to the impact of products, practices, and accessibility of certain gambling products, such as, for example, online slots, which have 50% of the people that use online slots are either problem or at-risk gamblers. So it's a huge proportion of revenue that's coming from this particular demographic. So I think the government's understanding has definitely shifted, and therefore what follows from that is I think a desire to look at remote sector products in the same way they looked at fixed odds betting terminals and the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals. So we're expecting the review that's going to be announced early next month, we anticipate, to be wide-ranging and to include things like stakes and prizes online. There's very little justification for limiting the stakes for content on machines, but not the same content online. There's a growing gambling reform built off of the fixed odds betting terminals campaign. So the all-party group on gambling-related harm, which was the all-party group on fixed odds betting terminals, is a cross-party group that's very influential, with a lot of influential MPs in there. The Peers for Gambling Reform group of 150 lords in House of Lords, pushing for the recommendations of the Gambling Industry Select Committee. There's several different charities now that are all relatively on the same page in the kind of reforms that they want to see. So things have I think, moved on significantly from when reformers had the success over fixed odds betting terminals. And I think crucially, every single newspaper and the public attitudes are very much aligned with the asks of the reformers. So here's some examples from Survation, which is polling that Clean Up Gambling commissioned. So 82% of people think that children shouldn't be exposed to gambling advertising at all, and 82% are in favour of a hard limit on deposits. So that applies across gambling operators. So that 75% say that only those based in the UK should be licensed and be able to operate in the UK. And this is quite important given we're about to leave the European Union, and the government's very interested in kind of the post-Brexit economy and how what principles will underpin that. So I think that's worth keeping an eye on. And I think the scary one is more people would support an outright ban than would oppose one. And we don't want a ban. We don't think that would protect the public. We think it's better that gambling, online gambling, all forms of gambling are licensed and regulated. In that way, you protect people. We don't want to, we don't think that prohibition is the answer. 68. So in terms of like what limits the public are sort of aligned with, 68% would cap slots at under £5 a spin. That makes sense given the maximum stake in casinos on slots is £5. The maximum stake on B3 content on fixed odds betting terminals is £2. And 65% would back a limit of under £50 a week on deposits. Now, again, we support this either. We don't think there should be a hard limit on the amount someone can deposit into a gambling account. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see where broadly the public are when they're asked these questions, what they think is a reasonable level. So the public is more prohibitionist than gambling reformers. I think it's fair to say. The Social Market Foundation proposed a soft cap of £100 a month prior to enhanced due diligence. So effectively, everyone would be free to deposit up to £100, around £25 a week. And this was a figure that was derived through quite a rigorous economic analysis of household income and looking at the lowest income households, and obviously taking into account what the vast majority of gamblers deposit. And this wouldn't impact the vast majority of gamblers. This would just impact a very small proportion. And it's within that small proportion that there is a high proportion of people that are experiencing harm. So that's where the enhanced due diligence would come in. And this would be overseen by an independent body, perhaps an ombudsman or perhaps the Gambling Commission. Perhaps it could tie into a single customer view that I know that the Gambling Commission is developing. But this is what I think we are more aligned with, the idea of a soft cap. We don't think you should limit completely people's ability to deposit money into a gambling account. If they can afford to, then we see no issue with that. The House of Lords Gambling Select Committee has called for stake limits commensurate with land-based venues. So that's pretty much aligned with public opinion and certainly what we'll be pushing for. And the all-party parliamentary group on gambling-related harm is an advertising ban, a complete outright advertising ban, which covers promotion and sponsorship too, which is certainly something we'll be campaigning for as the review progresses. The Gambling Commission looks like they're going to be consulting on the affordability model in due course, and probably developing the single customer view. Now, this could tie in quite nicely to the Social Market Foundation's report, as I mentioned before. And the Gambling Act review, which we're expecting early next month, is likely to include advertising, stake limits, affordability, regulation. Obviously, the Gambling Commission has come under a lot of scrutiny from the Public Accounts Committee in the UK for not adequately regulating the sector. And there has been, I think, a unanimous consensus over the need for an ombudsman to provide consumer redress, because it's done in a very ad hoc way at the moment. In fact, it takes up, I think, a lot of operator resources, having to deal with the casework involved with customer redress anyway. So I think it would be much better if that was outsourced to an independent third party, much better for consumer protection and consumer rights. And then there's the issue of research and treatment, which at the moment in Britain is funded through a voluntary levy that goes to, entities that have been approved by the Gambling Commission, which obviously operators' discretion over who they fund. So we'd like to see that process made more independent, but we expect that research and treatment will form part of the review. It's worth also mentioning that 71% of the public, according to Survation, support the idea of £100 a month soft cap. So the industry, I don't think in Britain is learning from the mistakes around fixed odds betting terminals. The structural problems with the industry, again, I go back to the 60% of gross gambling yield coming from the 5% who are likely to be experiencing harm. These cannot be addressed through public relations exercises or window dressing. And I think one example of where the sector and those that are kind of representing the sector have sort of treated the public like idiots, really, was around the advertising ban. Now, we know that they introduced a whistle-to-whistle ban on advertising last year, which obviously a welcome step, hasn't actually reduced the exposure of advertising or reduced the spend on advertising. So that's obviously gone into away from broadcast and into other avenues such as digital. But during the lockdown, the industry said they wouldn't advertise on TV at all. And in the small print, it said, but we will advertise. We won't advertise casino content. We won't advertise gaming products. But in the small print, it was like, we will actually advertise safer gambling messages. Now you might think, okay, that might be an improvement, but it's still advertising. It's still, people were still seeing the brands, and people were still thinking, hold on a minute, I thought that they said that they weren't advertising during the lockdown. And then there was obviously a bit of a backlash in the press over this. So these kind of things, which create short-term positive headlines for the sector, but do long-term damage, obviously do set, I think, the interests of the industry back, particularly as we're approaching a Gambling Act review. And I think the industry's talked a lot about affordability, and they've done so in the context of trying to guard against limits to stakes online. And they've been quite belligerent about that. But I think once a proposal on how to actually run an affordability model was put forward by the Social Market Foundation, they should have embraced that proposal and worked constructively with it. And instead, there were just charges of nanny statism. Now, this is nowhere near where the public are. The public are, I'd say, much more, I said before, prohibitionist than the gambling reformers. And to claim that this is nanny statist, or to claim that this line of attack has any resonance with the public, is completely, I think, off-piste. And therefore, I think it's incumbent on the industry, for its own sake, to engage with the central demands of reformers. They didn't do these things in the fixed odds betting terminal debate. They refused to engage with the central demand of the stake that £100 a spin on the high street, maybe that was a bit too high. They couldn't come to terms with that. They couldn't actually accept that £100 a spin was too high. I say it all the time. I say it again. If they'd voluntarily reduced it to £20 in 2016, they'd still have machines now on the street that enabled bets at £20 a spin, because they would have engaged with a central demand of reformers, and they would have engaged with a central policy ask. But they're refusing to do that. They're refusing to do that again with stake limits online. I mean, how is unlimited stakes online justifiable in the eyes of a policymaker and in the eyes of government that is about to review online stakes and prizes? The idea that it could be unlimited, I think, is just a non-starter. So they have to engage with that on its own terms. And they can't just obfuscate and say, what about affordability? Because when affordability models are put forward, as we saw with the Social Market Foundation, they then just say it's nanny statist. Okay, well, we agree with the principle of affordability in some abstract way, but we don't agree with the actual detail of someone's well thought through proposal. I mean, none of these things are credible. So they have to actually engage, I think, with the essential demands. Otherwise, they're going to end up with the equivalent of the government turning around and saying, well, you're not engaging properly, so it's £2 a spin. Exactly as I said, it's irrelevant. If they don't do that, they become irrelevant to the debate that's taking place. So here's, I think, what it's worth bearing in mind is that I think reform is inevitable, given the cross-party consensus and given the public opinion, given the media is very much on side with gambling reform. I think there has to be an acceptance that the status quo won't hold. And even if some time is bought, that it's inevitable that it will eventually lead to some significant reform. But I think that should be embraced by larger operators in particular. I think more regulatory barriers is a positive thing for the consumer, and it's a positive thing for established operators. And I think really it's a question of whether operators want to withstand the short-term reduction in profits for long-term sustainability. I think that is the trade-off. I think these companies, the remote gambling sector as a whole, to have the consent of the public and of government to operate, it is going to have to reform, and therefore that should be embraced on an existential level. And I think if it isn't, then the alternative is that there will be growing clamour for prohibition. There will be growing clamour for bans. And that's, again, I'll reiterate, that's not something we support. But you can see the direction of travel. You can see how the public attitudes are shifting. And I think the alternative to not embracing reform now may be that profits are maintained for a short time, but then fall off a cliff because the sector is no longer allowed to operate.